Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Nikon Z5 Mark II. Now, in the short time since the Z5 Mark II has been announced, it has already increased Nikon's market share. Why? Well, because it's a full-frame camera that costs under $1,700. Not that that in itself is unique, but what is unique about the Z5 Mark II is that it doesn't have any of the typical hallmarks of being intentionally reduced or crippled in order to not compete with the higher-end models in Nikon's lineup. And so we've got all the features that typically might be removed, things like dual card slots, in-body image stabilization, having a good performing and high specs on both the monitor, the LCD, and the viewfinder. We have a full-size battery. We have decent burst, and along with that, decent buffer rates. So all of these things are areas where a lot of times they'll be scrimping or intentionally kind of settling it down market, and so that it won't compete with higher models. None of those things are true here, and so a lot of people are saying, at what I can afford, this is the best camera that I can buy. And I would say that my opinion, after having spent time with the Z5 Mark II, is it is definitely the best camera that you can buy under $2,000 if you're looking for full frame, and very likely to compete with those that are even a little bit north of $2,000. And so we'll explore why that is in today's review, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off.
Now, in disclosure, this camera and then also the 35mm f1.8s lens that I'm reviewing on it, they were loaned to me by Nikon Canada. However, they have had no input in this review and they won't see it before you. This is a completely independent review and my conclusions are my own. Let's dive in and take a look at the build, handling, and feature set here. Now, I will say this. It is the smaller of Nikon's bodies, but it is only small in the Nikon sphere. And so it is, as you can see here, it's considerably smaller than, say, my Z8. But it's really this smallest of Nikon full-frame cameras is really as big as, say, the Sony Alpha 1, which is maybe the largest of Sony's cameras. This is a full half-pound heavier than, say, the Canon R8, which competes in this class. And so it's not a small camera, and I think that that's a niche that still needs to be filled by Nikon, but this is probably not it, even if it is smaller than some of their other models. It is 5.3 inches in width, or 134 millimeters. It is 4 inches in height, or 100.5 millimeters, and it is 2.8 inches deep at the grip, or 72 millimeters. Now, surprisingly, the previous camera that was in this class that shares a lot of the overall specifications is Nikon ZF, and it has a more retro style body. It's got some style in that and more retro style control scheme. However, in many ways, the Z5 Mark II just kind of makes more sense for a lot of people. Ironically, the ZF is actually both taller and wider than what the Z5 Mark II is, but the huge difference, as you can see from this diagram, is where it comes to the actual the grip itself. And the grip is almost non-existent on a ZF. It's more of a pinch style camera, whereas this grip actually feels really great, not only in my hands, but I handed it around to a variety of people with different size hands, and everyone says, yeah, it feels good in my hand. Now, you can see here on me that I do have room to get most of my pinky on the grip, not 100% of it, maybe about half, but enough to where it still feels comfortable in my hand. And so I do think that as far as the physicality, if the goal is ergonomics, this is really a great size camera. It's not over large, it's not over small. The only concern I would say is for those that really want to travel light. And certainly Nikon has nothing that is the equivalent of Sony's A7C series, for example. The body here is magnesium alloy, and so as a byproduct, this is a little bit heavier than what a lot of the competing cameras are. It is 1.5 pounds or 700 grams, and so it's not particularly lightweight. It does have a lot of custom controls for this class, and so that includes having 2 function buttons on the front, and frankly, I don't ever see that except for on, the more mid-tier to premium level cameras. And so I love having that. Up top we have a button that is kind of dedicated by default towards picture control, but it is a fully customizable button. And of course, the majority of other buttons on here can be customized to different functions. And so you really can create a lot of shortcuts. And so I certainly appreciate that. Again, that doesn't feel entry level at all. One of the things that is consistent about Nikon's control scheme, so if you're used to it, it's fine. And, I'm somewhat used to it at this point. It's still, I think it's an area that could be improved. And that is where a lot of these processes like changing exposure compensation or ISO, they're a 2-step process. You've got to click a button and then you've got to rotate the rear wheel. Now there is a setting that you can change, which I immediately do, that will allow you to where you don't have to hold down the button and rotate the wheel, but you can just press it and then rotate the wheel to get that job. And I find that it just helps you to not be trying to do 2 things at once in the same way. But I would prefer that control scheme to change a bit as it is on most other cameras. Other thing that I would like to see changed is that we have a D-pad here in the back. I would love for them to move to a Sony or Canon style wheel there. This is kind of a Nikon consistent thing, but that wheel just gives you one more control point, something like ISO, like that's on my Sony cameras. I always map ISO to that, and so it allows you to would allow you to control something like that. So that's one area that I would like to see improve. Outside of that, however, this has quite a very typical Nikon control scheme. There's a variety of buttons here on the back that will, and again, you can tweak functionality with that. We do have a joystick, and I love the fact that here at the display button, we also have this toggle that will allow you to switch between a different setup for stills and for video. And so all of that is very, very welcome. As far as what is here, as far as the wheels, everything moves with good precision. I like the placement of the on-off power button, which is a toggle around the shutter button. It allows that to be a one-handed operation, and so that's great rather than having to involve a second hand over on the left side for controlling that. And so overall, these controls, particularly the fact that we do have those function buttons at the front, all of that is great. We do have a dedicated video button that is near the ISO and exposure compensation buttons there. Up on top, we have a pretty typical mode dial here. It is not lockable, and I will note that if I was using a smaller bag, there was a few times that just in the in and out, that it's got a grippy side, and so something grabbed that and rotated it into some mode that I did not want. But I mean, I'm no serious issues there. Viewfinder is actually it's similar spec to what we see on something like the Z8, not 100% in terms of refresh rate, but in terms of resolution, it's 3.69 million dots, and on top of that, it's extremely bright. You can get up to 3,000 nits. Nikon claims that that is 6 times brighter than other cameras in this class. They don't really give data as to who they're comparing that to, but I can say it's a great viewfinder, and particularly a great viewfinder for this class. It blows away something like what you're going to find on the A7C series, for example. So nice and bright, good visibility, good level of magnification. All of that I consider to be excellent. Likewise, we have a fully articulating LCD screen here, touchscreen. I love that. I also love the fact that this is 2.1 million dots of resolution. It's also a little bit bigger, 3.2 inches as opposed to 3 inches compared to the competing ones. And so it's higher resolution, it's a little bit larger. It's a great screen, and it allows you to use it because it can get nice and bright. You're able to use that even in bright conditions. And so both of those specifications are fantastic for this level or class of camera. All of that is great. Also great is the fact that we have a nice door here on the side rather than down in the battery compartment, and we have dual slots for, now it's only SD cards, but it's UHS 2 rated SD cards here at the side, and so that's fantastic. We do have good weather sealing in the body itself, and down here at the bottom we do have a full-size battery, the EN-EL15C battery. It's a 2280 mAh rated battery pack, so similar to the higher end ones that you're seeing in models ranging from Canon, Sony, Fuji, all of those type things. Nikon does have a larger capacity battery that they put in the Z9, but this is the same battery you're going to find in the Z8 or the Z6 Mark III, etc., etc. It's rated up to 380 stops in this setting. As is often the case, most real-world people are going to get more shots out of that, but it's always a smart thing to have some backup batteries. Anyway, you do have the ability on the side here with the ports, you do have the ability to charge view via USB-C, and you can even, if you're shooting video, for example, you can be continually powering while shooting during that, and so you can extend your battery life kind of indefinitely, though there's other limitations that will come into play. We also have both a microphone input 3.5 millimeter and a 3.5 millimeter headphone monitoring jack that also doubles as a remote trigger port. Now, HDMI here is micro HDMI. I don't love that, but I mean, that's the standard for this class. Every other camera in this class has the same, so I'm not really going to dock it over that. Not only do we have VR or in-body image stabilization in here, but it is excellent. It is rated up to 7.5 stops, and so nothing about that feels entry-level. That best what's in my Z8, for example, and I was able to get really good handheld results when I was testing for low light performance. I shot with the Viltrox 135 millimeter f1.8. I shot a 1/5 of a second exposure and handheld, and it was perfectly steady, no problem with that at all. One thing I will say about Nikon's VR, particularly in relation to Sony, is not only do I think that it's better, it seems to perform better with third-party lenses to where they just feel more stable. In fact, I would say that in almost every case where I have reviewed say a Tamron or a Viltrox lens on both Sony and then on Nikon, I have preferred their performance on Nikon, and so that's fantastic. Now, a couple of things that I'll continue to critique a little bit. First of all, I mean, it's not going to change at this point, but I just do want to point out the absurdity of it, and that is that Nikon persists in doing everything in reverse to everyone else. And so that includes, the process of actually removing and mounting lenses. It goes in the opposite direction. And because it's against the standard, it means that in the process of removing lenses, you're taking lenses off in the same direction that lens hoods come off. And so particularly with smaller lenses, as you grab them, it's not all that difficult to dislodge a lens hood in the process. I mean, they're not going to change it at this point. They can't change it right in the middle of the Z-mount segment. But I certainly hope that in the next iteration of Nikon that they just kind of go along with everyone else with that. Other thing that I do miss here, and it's a very, very minor niggle considering the price point of this, but as soon as I took off the front camera cap, I noticed a bit of dust on the sensor. It doesn't have that protective shield that is on a camera like the Z8, and it certainly is missed here. And of course, the other thing they're going to get as the one kind of price-cutting thing you're going to get in this class relative to, say, the Z6 Mark III, there is no top-mounted LCD here. And again, I'm not really critiquing that because none of the other cameras have it in this class. However, it is something you might miss. But at $1,700, this is a remarkably fully featured camera in terms of the controls, the specifications on viewfinders, VR, card slots, all of that. Fantastic. Great job, Nikon. So as we shift towards autofocus, let's talk a bit about the shutter, burst rate, buffer, those type things. And so we have a mechanical shutter. It is a maximum of 1/8,000th as opposed to 1/4,000th. It's not unusual in this class for mechanical shutters to be limited to 1/4,000th. And so again, we've got that higher rate. We don't really have the same kind of faster electronic shutter that you'll sometimes see in this class. It's there, but I'll get to that in just a second. This does have a much lower readout speed. It's not a stacked sensor, and while these cameras start to encroach a little bit into, because they have good autofocus system, they have the ability to track, not, as we're going to see, not bad buffer, not bad burst speed, but it is a lower readout speed, and so you will have more potential issues with things like rolling shutter, and that's going to be much more magnified if you shift into the electronic shutter. And so if you're doing that to track action, the problem is if it's action that's moving, quickly at all, you may regret that decision because you're not going to get as good of results. As far as the maximum flash sync, it is 1/200th of a second. Again, that's not bad at all for this class. There's some that are lower, will go down to like 1/160th of a second. And so that's certainly like par for the course essentially in this class. As far as the burst rate is 11 frames per second with full, and that's shooting RAWs, that's with full tracking along the way. That's really not bad at all, particularly when you consider that the Mark I Z5 only had a 4.5 frame per second burst rate. So we've more than doubled the burst rate on that, and 11 frames per second gets into the class of being very, very useful. Now you can, as mentioned, you can move into JPEG only modes where you can get anywhere between 14 and 30 frames per second, with some caveats, some limitations there, and JPEG only. And so, I mean, if your absolute priority is just getting some shots in, then you certainly do have that option there. But if you can stick in the 11 frames per second and shoot with the mechanical shutter, you'll probably be happier with your end results in terms of the photos, as long as that's fast enough for your setting. The maximum raw buffer depth it's capped at 200 frames, which is not bad at all. That's actually great. Now, more practically, you will see some diminishing returns depending on how much you're doing as far as like a lossless compression. And so your compression ratios will limit that a bit more. However, even shooting at lossless at 11 frames per second, you can still get 145 frames in the buffer depth. And that is actually really, really competitive for this class. That's certainly enough to capture any kind of action. You don't have a higher shutter rate. Sometimes you can go all the way up to, say, 1/30,000th of a second with an electronic shutter. There's no such option here. You are capped at 1/8000th of a second. Frankly, I don't find that to be a particularly limiting principle most of the time. And so for this class, all of these specifications are actually really, really good. As is the autofocus system. It doesn't have the same autofocus system as their highest end sports type cameras. However, it has had trickle down technology that started with the Z9 that has flowed down into this. And so you have the ability to have 9 different trackable subjects, including dedicated bird AF mode. And what this has that I still am waiting for Sony to really do, Canon does have it as well, is that it does have a very good automatic mode where you can just put it in auto subject recognition, and it typically works very, very well. If you're in a specific instance where you're doing birding, for example, certainly switch into the birding mode. But for most of the time, if you're switching between humans and animal subjects, etc., like that, it switches over on its own just fine. And so I really, really appreciate that. The specifications here are 299 autofocus points. Frankly, those figures have become less and less relevant, in my opinion, because every company has a different way of calculating those, and sometimes they get into the ridiculous, where there's thousands of AF points. What really matters is coverage, and in this case, we've got most of the sensor covered with AF points, and so you can track all across the frame. That's really what matters most to me. There is, tracking capabilities are really quite good. Now, with this viewfinder, this is not a stack sensor. So with this viewfinder, you are not going to get like a blackout free when you're tracking. If you're in the viewfinder and you are shooting a trackable subject, with AF, you are going to see blackout in between frames. Now, that means that it's just not as easy to track subjects because you're not visually able to predict quite as well because your vision is continually just coming in little chunks. And so if you're really serious about shooting sports, you're going to want to move up into a model like the Z6 Mark III, something where you're not getting that blackout. However, for casual shooters and people that occasionally do sports, it's fine. I mean, it's not as good, but it works. I found that when I shot a couple of things with action, I shot softball, and I had zero problems there. The action is not super fast, and so it was able to pick up quickly, recognize subjects as it should, and everything is very well focused, so I have zero problems there. When it came to tracking bees coming into my hives, it wasn't like, I definitely saw better results with the Z8 than what I did here, but it wasn't by a huge margin. I was still able to pick up bees in flight, which is pretty mind-blowing, and to get accurately focused results on those. So, I mean, it's pretty great. Also, it focuses down as far as -10 EV according to Nikon. I tried to test this in basically shooting in the dark, and certainly autofocus slowed down, no question about that. However, it did eventually lock on accurately, even in essentially dark conditions. I mean, this is 1/5 of a second at f1.8 at 12,800 with a third-party lens. I mean, nothing to complain about there. And so in less extreme situations, this is going to quickly lock on and give you accurate focus. So that's great because it just expands the kind of venues that you can work with. Those of you that have used various adapters like from Megadap, it's, again, this is a capable autofocus system, and enough so that it can compensate somewhat for porting over, Sony E-mount lenses and still do the calculations necessary to get decent autofocus with them. So, all told, that's pretty great. Video AF is also good. And one thing I will say with Nikon that I have learned is that I do need to be a little bit more proactive about tweaking menu settings. I don't find that I can go right off the default settings as effortlessly as I do with Sony and Canon. However, if I tweak the settings, I'm able to largely get what I'm looking for. And I shot multiple segments like this, where I had like more of a stable shot. It did perfectly fine with those. And then in other settings where I was moving along from subject to subject, I found that, autofocus generally worked well. I will see maybe a bit more pulsing every now and then in making subject transitions, sometimes a bit of a back pulse and doing a focus pull. I see a bit more on that on Nikon than what I do on Canon or Sony, but I mean, it is close, very close. And relative to other Nikon cameras, I think it's doing just fine. In terms of the video specs themselves, we can get up to 4K 60. That does come with a 1.5 times crop. However, the 4K 30 has no such crop factor. It is giving you a full readout there. You have a variety of bitrate options. Now, I will note what you don't necessarily have at 4K is any like low bit rates, to where if you're wanting to just kind of shoot more like long format, and want a lower bit rate, you don't have a lot of options there. However, on the higher end, you've got lots of options, all the way up to a 12-bit in RAW, in camera at 420 megabits per second, which is pretty impressive in terms of the quality of the footage that you can get out of this camera. You can shoot in N-Log, you can shoot HLG, and I will note that Nikon's been kind of proactive in terms of developing LUTs, and some that they have developed with Red that are free downloads that will allow you to get, in my opinion, better looking end results than what we have seen with some of the other previous LUTs in the past. Recording limit seems to be pegged at 2 hours and 5 minutes. That's according to real life experience, and then also what Nikon says. And so, but I mean, if you're just shooting off the battery, you're at 4K 30, you're probably not going to get anything longer than that out of a battery anyway. And also that's going to use up a fair bit of storage media. So I think it all kind of shakes out appropriately. And so anyway, you do have those options there. So video specs, good. Footage looks good. AF, as I've already mentioned during video, all of that is good. No big concerns there. And I think, again, that this is solid specs for this level of camera. Now the sensor itself is nothing new or glamorous. This is a 4.5 megapixel full frame format CMOS sensor. Same sensor as what you're going to find in a camera like the ZF, for example. It's a sensor that's been around a bit to this point. And it does have a little bit higher resolution than what some of the other 24 megapixel sensors do. Those tend to be 6,000 by 4,000 in terms of resolution. This is very slightly higher at 6,048 by 4,032 pixels, which can technically get you up to 24.5 megapixels. As far as the dynamic range, and by the way, for those of you that want to deep dive into the sensor performance, I'll throw that in at the end of the video. But just the broad strokes, the dynamic range is rated by Photons to Photos, which is a source that I trust, at 11.15 stops. And so that falls slightly behind the R8, which is right under 11.5 stops, and the A7C also, they're within a few fraction points of each other, again, around 11.5 stops. The shadow recovery I found in my test is actually quite good. And one thing I want to highlight about this sensor, I was very impressed by the color fastness. In all the various tests that I did, I got consistent colors. I didn't see any kind of color cast or tint. I did not see any kind of color banding. And so a really great job in that regard from Nikon. Shadow recovery, I found that I could do very cleanly at 4 stops with just a little bit more negative impact at 5 stops, but still usable, I would say. And so very good on the shadow recovery end. Highlight recovery was also quite good, in my opinion. I was able to do very clean at 2 stops and really not bad at 3 stops. It wasn't perfect. The image isn't as bright as what it should be, and there are a few hot spots there, but color swatches were mostly recovered. You know, really, I would say for a camera like this, this is doing a really, really good job. When it comes to dynamic range, it's not quite as good as what the Canon or Sony sensors is competing with. However, all of these sensors are so good relative to what they were a generation ago that, frankly, it's not all that big of a deal. The ISO range, native ISO range, is 100 through 51,200. I found that really my ISO performance, I thought it was quite good. I saw that it was still very clean at 1600, looked clean to me at 3200. Certainly, I would say usable at both 6400 and 12,800, and that wasn't just in my test. For example, if I show you this shot that's just a real-world shot taken at ISO 12,800, you can see that certainly there is, even at 100% magnification, there's some noise there. As far as like just pixel noise, some roughness to that, but overall the image is entirely useful. Again, colors look good. It looks like a natural image with almost kind of a film grain type look to it. And so I found even at the higher levels of 25,600 and 51,200, they're, increasingly dirty along the way, but in a pinch, they could be usable, particularly if you're shooting monochrome and a bit of that roughness is maybe a desirable effect. But even taking monochrome out of the equation, there's no color cast there. There's no color shift. And so that to me makes them a lot more usable. And what I also didn't see is any kind of like grid pattern start to show up. And so overall, I was actually quite impressed in that regard. Now, as mentioned with the resolution at 6,048 by 4032 pixels, it's okay for most applications. I've become very accustomed to having higher resolution. I own 5 cameras right now, and all of them are a minimum of 40 megapixels. And so I am used to higher resolution. However, I will say that this is usable for a lot of situations. One thing that I will say is that if you're wanting to crop, you obviously have less flexibility to do so. If you switch into APS-C mode, for example, it's only 10.5 megapixels. That's not super useful. I mean, you can get by with it, but you have like zero crop room left after that. There is a pixel shift mode. You can shoot up to 32 frames in that, and you can combine that into a 96 megapixel image. I will say on that, it does require you to use, it's free software from Nikon, but you can only do it through a Nikon software to combine those. You can't combine in camera. You can't really combine it easily through, Lightroom or Photoshop. And so to me, it's a little less useful because of that extra step, but that does allow you, if you have a still subject, because remember, you're shifting the sensor and getting a variety of images, it does mean you need to have a very still subject for that to be successful. But if that's the case, that's an option of getting higher resolution out of this camera. As far as the storage size, your like lossless RAWs, they're going to be around 30 megapixels, high efficiency plus around 16, high efficiency around 12. There isn't other resolution points to choose, but again, file size is not too bad. The colors I found looked good out of here. I don't really have any major complaints. I do still just kind of instinctively prefer either Canon or Fuji's color science over Nikon's, but it's splitting hairs. They're all roughly similar. Again, you do have a variety of looks. We'll call them film simulations. Again, not as good as what Fuji offers, but there are some interesting options there. If you're a RAW shooter and not a JPEG shooter, you might want to reprogram that top button to something that's more useful, because again, in RAW, you can apply any of those looks in post, and so you don't have to, it's kind of pointless to select one in camera because of that. If you're shooting JPEGs, obviously a different story. So a good sensor, not an exceptional sensor, but a good sensor, and I really didn't have any actual complaints when I tested it. So my conclusion is this. This is a camera that I think is strong in all the areas that an average photographer needs. There's no fatal flaw or compromise that I can put to and say, oh, Nikon, they really crippled the camera in this way or another. And so I really, really appreciate the fact that Nikon has just kind of gone all in this particular model. And yeah, it probably will cannibalize some Z6 Mark III type sales, because you can spend $500 or more less and get a fully capable camera. But as is already happening, I think it's a smart move by Nikon, because they are stealing some market space from Canon and from Sony. And I think in particular, I would be worried if I were Canon, because Nikon does now have more access to third-party lenses, and so it has become a more attractive platform, I would say, to me personally, as compared to Canon, because I can get some really compelling lenses on there, and a lot of the Nikon lenses I tend to like as well. And so anyway, I think that it is and it will continue to steal some market share from those other two major brands. To me, that makes it a smart move by Nikon. I will say on the negative side, it's still not a very compact body. And one thing I think that Nikon does need to do is they do need to have some kind of dedicated travel body. I mean, I would love to see something that is a competition for the A7C series from Sony, where it's smaller, lighter, and actual travel worthy, because there are some really interesting options, particularly now that you can get all the Viltrox Air lenses that are coming. Those lenses are really intriguing on a small body. And yeah, they make more sense on the Z5 Mark II than what they do on my Z8, but it's still a pretty big camera to put some of those lenses on. So I'd love to see them do that. All told, however, I am very, very impressed by what Nikon has done here. And based on what I've seen from this camera, they deserve a little bit more market share. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There is linkage to an image gallery and buying links there. And if you want a deeper dive into the sensor performance, stay tuned with me right now, and we're going to jump into that together.
All right, we'll start our examination of this sensor by taking a look at ISO performance. So here is base ISO 100. If we take a look around here, we can see that the blacks are nice and inky. There's no pattern or noise that's in the various color swatches. You can look at this mirror, which is a place that shows up. And then definitely in this pattern, here's where you'll start to see kind of the roughness of noise increase. So this is what everything should look like optimally. So through ISO 800, we can see, if we're looking at a pixel level, that it still looks remarkably similar. Maybe just a tiny bit of noise showing up there, but down in this zone, it's still nice and clean. Black levels look nice and inky. Colors are basically identical. Moving on to 1600 and still comparing to our base ISO, we can see that once again there is a tiny bit of noise there, but not enough that you would see it anywhere outside of a pixel level. Still clean looking here, black levels, so thus contrast still looking pretty good. Moving on to 3200. Now, obviously, we're starting to kick up into what you would start to consider high ISO range. Still looking nice and clean here. You could tell that the black levels are not 100% as good, but still nice and black and also very even. And the color swatches are looking good. Looking in the mirror of this SLR, you can see a very, very fine noise there, but nothing destructive at all. Now, by 6400, you can see that that noise pattern has just increased a bit. And so if I toggle back and forth here, you can see that difference. So there's just a little bit more noise that's present now. But again, while it's a little rougher here, it's still not looking too bad. And if we step out for a moment, color constancy is still very, very good. That's true up to ISO 12800, which is what I often will kind of use as a practical limit and what I will actually use in maybe an event type setting. I try not to go any further than that. Typically, in this case, you can definitely see that there is some of that fine pattern noise, but what I don't see is any kind of grid, any kind of color issues. Black levels are still looking pretty decent here. You can see it's getting rougher in terms of the noise here, but not in any kind of unusable way. I referred to this image here, and so now you can look at it maybe a little closer. And so you can definitely see some of that fine pattern noise that's throughout the image itself. Looking at it at a pixel level, yeah, you can see that it's there, it's showing up in all of this, but no grids, no discoloration. I think it's still a very usable image. Now, beyond this, it becomes a law of somewhat diminishing returns, though I will say you can still see that colors stay very good, and I'm particularly impressed at the upper limit of 51,200. It's not unusual at all, even with much more expensive cameras, to see a whole kind of color shift towards magenta or green. I don't see that at all. Now, our noise is increasingly getting rougher, as you can see here. But I don't know, it's not all that destructive to me, and frankly, I don't see 51,200 as being all that much worse than 25,600. And I'm pleasantly surprised by the fact that while I can see a little bit of that snow going on there in the black levels still look pretty decent to my eye. So overall, high ISO performance, very good. So next, dynamic range. And so we're going to start with our highlight recovery. And so I've already moved up to 2 stops here. You can see what happens when it's overexposed by 2 stops. Some of the color swatches start to get washed out. You can see here that there are various hot spots where it's no longer even. But if we shift over here to the right, we can see that colors have come back. You can see in this row, for example, colors have returned that weren't there before. Some of the gray levels have returned. And just general saturation levels are better. What's more, if we zoom in here, we can see that some of these places where hot spots had emerged and texture information was lost, it has been recovered. Color is even once again now in the timer face there. So, good. Now, if we move on to 3 stops, it's still a good performance, but you can also see some of the flaws. Now, if we look up here at the color swatches, there's a lot of them that have been lost. And here we can see that they have mostly, but not entirely, been recovered. Mostly being pretty good in this situation. On the timer face, by and large, we still have a fairly even performance. No kind of really weirdness to it. However, you can see here at the Honeywell Pentax, some of the texture of the metal has been lost and not regained. Places like this hot spot here have not quite come back. And so you can see also generally that the image looks a little bit dim. We've lost some contrast in the process. That carries on to its logical conclusion at 4 stops of overexposure, where you can see now that the image just looks dingy and a lot of stuff has been lost. Colors are lost that have not been recovered. The consistency of color across the timer face, a lot of this texture information, all this stuff blown out. Not a usable image. And so up to 3 stops, you might get away with it. Anything beyond that, you won't. Now, shadow recovery tends to be easier for modern cameras, so I'm going to jump all the way to 4 stops. And so you can see here with the original exposure, this is very, very underexposed. And so there's lots of stuff that is crushed here. So let's see how we've done in terms of recovery. If we look here on this texture of the grip of the SLR, you can see that not only has it been recovered, I don't see any kind of color blotching there. No issues there. If we look inside here, not a lot of noise showing up. Down in this zone here, you can see it was completely crushed. It's recovered, and I don't see a lot of noise in that area as well. And so in general, that is a very successful recovery. Now, if we jump up to 5 stops of recovery, it still actually looks pretty good. However, it's a little less good. You can see just a little bit more noise that's showing up there. And particularly if I look down in this zone, there's a bit of noise showing up there and maybe just a little less consistency in the dark areas. I also can see a little bit of a hot pixel that has popped up there. But overall, it's looking really quite good, even for that type of recovery. So that means I'm going to have a lot of versatility within a single frame. Now, I'm not recommending that you do what I've done on the right. I'm doing this to exaggerate what you can do as far as trying to recover the highlights of this image and then the shadows of this image. And so this is for illustration purposes. This looks like the HDR craze where people were combining images to get this effect, a decade ago. It's not really a great look. So you can see here in the highlights, this being one of the brightest points, you can see it really hasn't fully successfully recovered there, pulling that all the way up. Here, where it was less extreme, we have pulled more color back into this area, and so I would consider that to be more successful. Now, as far as shadow recovery, basically all of this grass was crushed out. You can see that that's been recovered fairly cleanly. It doesn't look too bad in this area here where the bench was almost obscured in the shadow. That's all been recovered quite well. Enough information here. If this was higher resolution, you could probably read these signs in here. So I would consider the shadow recovery to be really quite impressive overall. So let's talk resolution. So as I mentioned, you can do the pixel shift, and so that pixel shift can do up to 32 different frames to combine into one image. So here is just one of those images from that sequence, and here is the end result when they have been combined together, and it produces this NEFX file format. So you can see if we go into a pixel level, there's a lot more pixels on tap here. And so this is both at 100% magnification. And so this just shows how much more is there. Again, you're going to need a still subject because any kind of movement is going to create an issue where they won't combine as cleanly. But you can see you can definitely very successfully, with the right subject, vastly improve the amount of resolution that you can throw on it. Now, in terms of the native resolution, just as I've mentioned, the cropping capabilities are, they're limited. You're not going to be able to deeply crop into this image because there's just not enough pixels to do so. Here, for example, I've taken a crop out of that image and it looks okay, but you can see that I'm actually at a greater than 100% magnification trying to fill a 4K screen. And so here's what the actual pixels would look like. And so you're just it's a law of diminishing returns. You're having to scale up to get to a larger display like this. Now, finally, colors. I felt like colors were generally very good out of this sensor. I didn't notice anything that threw me off. Colors here look bright and clean. Here I used the Sunday preset, and so that kind of brightens everything up. I actually am quite partial it with a lot of like forest or landscape type images, and so it looks nice here. Colors are bright, but not garish or anything. Here, this is a more subtle color palette, but again, it's handling the various shades of greens. They all look greens and yellows, all look nice here. Here we've got some various shades of red that are a part of this. And again, it all looks natural and clean to me. Skin tones here are looking good. Again, the image itself looks very true to the setting. I think the colors look nice and clean and crisp. And so overall, a good result. Not a bad sensor at all, really.
And so as you can see, this is really quite a compelling camera, not just in what it does as far as its features, but it does a very solid job in terms of its sensor as well. As always, thanks for watching to the very end. Have a great day and let the light in.